welcome back. Ever since the pandemic began, we have seen more and more podcasts emerging, ranging from a wide variety of topics and subject matters. Well, there is a new one on the scene that will interest all of those of you who are interested in Caribbean fantasy, folklore, and science fiction. The Caribbean Science Fiction Network is a podcast that has recently began that spotlights emerging and established Caribbean voices who use science fiction genres to explore various aspects of Caribbean identity. With us today, we have the creator and host of the Caribbean Science Fiction Network, Jarrel De Matas, who will shed some light on the new and interesting podcast series. Good morning and welcome to AM Prime, Jarrel.
Hi, good morning, Nikolai. Thanks for having me, and good morning to your viewers as well.
Excellent, my pleasure. Now, tell us, when did the Caribbean Science Fiction Network come off of the ground exactly, and how has the challenge or the journey from that point to present been?
Yeah, this podcast was really born out of tragedy. I'm a PhD student and I write articles for the local newspaper. And when my dog died, I wrote an article just talking about how my dog Dante just inspired me to be more human, and how this non-human species could teach me how to be human by showing me love, hope, teaching me perseverance, etc. So I wrote an article based around that, and someone in Australia contacted me and wanted to feature that story on their podcast. I said yes, and I did the podcast. And while I was sort of being interviewed, I thought to myself, well, why not have a podcast of my own? And it came at an opportune time, because just trying to fill that void, that physical void, and trying to busy myself with during the pandemic, yes. I decided that the podcast, this idea, produced a great opportunity for me to spend that time then. And as it relates to the content, I just brought together my own interests as a PhD literature student, where science fiction has always been an interest of mine. So I brought that together and brought that in conversation with Caribbean literature, which is also my focus. And one thing led to another. I researched how to begin a podcast. And it was actually quite easy. You referenced the popularity of podcasts, and one of the reasons is because it's quite easy to set one up. So I just did my research. I reached out to writers who I would have come into contact with, mailing them saying, do you remember me? You may not have remembered me. Would you like to be featured on the podcast? And they all said yes. A couple of them reached out to me. I reached out to quite a few, and I have 2 episodes already, and I'm booked right up to episode 10.
Nice. And tell us, in terms of the formatting of it, how long is each podcast there about? And is it broken up into segments, or give us a bit more description in terms of how that flows?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a huge disparity between what doesn't make it into the actual podcast. So I've had interviews so far range from 45 minutes to over an hour. But the actual podcast, I'm trying to limit it to 30 minutes because, our attention spans.
Yes.
This research says we can focus on one thing for up to 8 minutes. But the good thing with podcasts is you can multitask. So that is really the format. It's a straight talk. We try to make literature and Caribbean science fiction accessible, which is a major thing for me. And to really enrich the lives of people. I had someone reach out to me and say, what is Caribbean science fiction? Is that a thing? And I'm like, yeah, it's a thing. And because you're asking that question, it requires even more attention to be paid to it.
Nice. And you're definitely filling a void there, because I'm sure there are people who may have had similar interests such as yours that you've developed here, and are now seeing a home and a space really for that to take place. Where do you see this podcast moving, be it in the next year or thereabout?
So right now, the plan is to do bi-weekly episodes. Like I mentioned, there's 2 already. There's 1 coming out next week. One of the ultimate goals really is to have 1 per week, 1 episode per week. And I also want to broaden the audience. So right now I can view my listeners by geographic location. And I've had people from Norway, from Sweden, from Poland, in France. But the majority is still in Trinidad and Tobago, and I can understand why.
Yes.
What I want to do, the goal really is to broaden that audience even wider and to have more people getting in touch with Caribbean science fiction and realizing that this podcast is on the cusp of something great. Your previous speaker, Lawrence, talked about the future, and it's a nice segue here because this form of literature in the podcast form is a future form of literature, as well as explicitly dealing with the future of humanity, really.
Nice. And it's very interesting, and I can guarantee that I'll be tuning in to the podcast. And speaking of tuning in, the platforms that you all are available on, because I'm seeing here a graphic, and you have a number of, be it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so forth. Tell us where we can access it and the times, because I know you said you're looking at bi-weekly. What times would it be available and so forth?
Yeah, so the time is non-specific, really. Every Friday, I probably try to shoot for like midday. That is really non-specific because it's just me so far. I mean, I'm working with someone else called Keisha Lewis who is interested in getting on board, but it's only me. And I have many things to do. So as regards to the time, that is not defined. But for sure, Friday, bi-weekly Fridays, that is the time it's going to come out. And with regard to the platforms, the most popular ones so far are Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor.fm, which you don't have to download anything. It's you can go onto the web, so you don't have to sign up either. There are no geographic restrictions such as with Spotify, so that is easily accessible, as well as other lesser known platforms like Breaker and Radio Public. More platforms are soon to be added. I'm sure you're familiar with TuneIn, a radio platform you can access. That can also use podcasts as well. So that's also the plan in terms of developing the reach, because I understand Apple Podcasts and Spotify may not be the most popular in Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, Jarrel, let me just say thank you for sharing this information with us, because I think it's very interesting looking at our Caribbean folklore, looking at some of the things that go bump in the night in a Caribbean mind, what that may be like, tying that with more or less these stories and putting it out there in a public way. I think it's very interesting, and it's something that once we invest enough energy into, and when I say we are talking about society, private sector and so forth, we have as part of our cultural product these excellent things, and I think we need to be doing a lot more, and I just want to congratulate you on taking the step to do just that, a lot more when it comes to our culture. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Jarrel.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nikolai.
Nice. And that was Jarrel De Matas, the host of the Caribbean Science Fiction Network. Be sure to check out his podcast coming to you on those platforms that he would have mentioned. And guys, that's how we end this morning's show. A really interesting show, speaking with the Youth Government Trinidad and Tobago, moving forward to the Heroes Foundation, and now ending with the Caribbean Science Fiction Network. A lot of inspiring young people doing things to help change the image that Trinidad and Tobago has and the experience of many other young people. So until Monday, you have the entire weekend. Please be safe.